deals, in common stock and investment-grade bond issues, not only to share the risk but to spread the goods about the street in a collegial fashion. Milken hated syndicated deals. He hated having a co-manager. He would not spread the goods, and they could keep their fraternity. Now was the comeuppance. Howard Brenner, a member of Drexel's executive committee who had been at the firm since it was Burnham and Company, admitted, "Some of our colleagues, at Drexel, especially the younger ones, were very arrogant, and it's come home to bite us." "To me, the investigation is a parable," declared another Drexel executive. "It has brought us down for our hubris, and are not paying sufficient attention to our transactions, and our dealings with other people. Things like sending people to another city for a roadshow. Not giving any bonds to a co-manager. Taking a piece of business from another firm which had already filed a prospectus. Other people have occasionally done this kind of thing to us, but I have a hunch that we started it. So far, the government doesn't seem to have evidence of anything illegal. But we are already so weakened, by the press reports of the investigation. It is as though we are paying the penalty for our other sins." In the months after Boesky Day, it seemed plain that even if Drexel and Milken were to survive, their idyll, in which Milken could raise billions in a matter of days for a hostile bid, in which no company in America was safe from him, would be ended. It was a time for epitaphs. I think the systematic realigning of corporate America, and putting parts of companies in the hands of guys who have major equity stakes in those companies, is the best thing we have done for our society, commented corporate finance partner Stephen Weinroth. The cat's out of the bag, and if the old guard establishment puts us out of business, they're not going to put the concept out of business, be it the LBO or the hostile takeover or valuing a company and breaking it up because the assets are worth more broken up than whole. Weinroth lapsed into the familiar refrain, articulated by Milken, Icahn and others of their persuasion, about the decline of corporate America in the hands of its managers, and its rescue by the new breed of manager-owners. Old companies were started by true entrepreneurs, who had children, some of whom were affected by the ills of the rich, he continued. They brought in professional managers, who ran the companies in a conservative fashion. But those professional managers didn't have an ownership stake. Their risk-reward ratio was skewed to being a conservator, not an initiator. Then the second generation, managers, grew to the top. And even if they were high quality as managers, they were certainly not entrepreneurial. And then that group promoted people who couldn't threaten them, and they in turn hired people inferior to them, who lived for their perks and compensation and ran their companies conservatively because they had no upside interest. And by the time you go through several generations of these managers, you have a company run by dull normals. It started to change in the FTIES, he said. As new businesses sprang up largely out of a new spurt of technological innovation, there were some entrepreneurial guys. More recently, all the LBO guys have said, "We want the managers to have a stake in this business, because we want them to get rich if they do well." Typically, 5 to 20% of a deal would be owned by management. "I think the principles are right," Weinroth concluded, "and the fact that some of our players are venal or self-interested or unpleasant is almost beside the point. There is a greater machine going, and if these guys don't make a go of it, then somebody else will buy the stock, and the ownership will reside very close to the helm. And Drexel had more to do with it than anyone else." The months after the November Boesky Day were rife with signs of Drexel's ebbing power. The first and most symbolic was Drexel's decision, announced in early December, to abandon its much-heralded move to the 47-story tower, 7 World Trade Center, which it had agreed to lease in its entirety in June, '86. Just as the announcement of the impending move to that imposing building had been a dramatic statement that Drexel was assuming its place among the established giants of Wall Street, so its cancellation suggested that that ascension was no more. The most mammoth publicly announced deals that Drexel had been backing when the Boesky news hit, Icon's bid for USX, Perelman's for Gillette and Sigaloff's, Wix's, just announced acquisition of Lear Siegler, came to a total of roughly $14 billion. For Icon, Perelman and Sigaloff, these deals would have represented an enormous expansion of their respective empires. In addition to collecting a king's ransom and financing fees in these deals, in USX, for example, Drexel's fee would have been roughly $250 million. Drexel would have reaped a golden harvest of divestiture business. But after Boesky Day, despite Drexel's assertions that it could still place the debt for these deals, those financings were deemed sufficiently questionable that the bidders' hands were weakened. Ultimately, all three deals foundered. Wix abandoned its acquisition of Lear Siegler, and Perelman and Icon were beaten back from their targets. In the next 6 months, the whole of the FI-RST half of 1987, Drexel did not back a single hostile bid. Other hallmarks of the Milken regime also disappeared, casualties of this new epoch in which Milken and Drexel would be forced to live under the government's microscope. Privately placed, unregistered bonds, for example, no longer changed hands en masse, moving from Milken's high rollers to the second-tier buyers in that FLO that was so integral to the Milken machine. Mark Schenkman of Schenkman Capital commented about 2 months after Boesky Day, "Private still trade. But now precise logs are kept, and they, Milken's salesmen and traders, can only talk to 20 FIVA people about it. It can't be a public distribution. They are reining Mike in." And at least some of the gold mine investment partnerships, through which Milken had built wealth FI-RST for his own people and then for a wider group in corporate finance, were closed down. The major partnership with corporate finance, which invested in buyouts, was named Concordia. In 1985, Concordia's return had been close to 100%. By the end of 1986, when it was closed out, it was FLET for the year. This was strange, since 1986 had been a soaringly Professor I table year at Drexel. That had to have been done on purpose, insisted one former Drexel employee, so that they could say, "See? We always knew that with the kind of risk we take we'd hit a bad year sooner or later." Within days of the Boesky plea, rival investment bankers had begun going down the list of Drexel clients, soliciting their business. While Drexel's traditional stable appeared still loyal, the blue-chip clients that Drexel had been struggling to win, whether by courtship or by coercion, whether by Martin Siegel or by Jim Dahl, quickly fell away. Theirs had been an uneasy alliance with Milken. In the months just prior to Boesky Day, Goodyear had brought Drexel in along with Goldman Sachs to advise it on a defensive restructuring. Viacom had hired Drexel along with Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette to assist in its management buyout. Ralston Purina had added Drexel as a third co-manager, along with Goldman, Sachs and Solomon, for an investment-grade bond issue. According to well-placed sources in each of these deals, Drexel was brought in for only one reason, so that it would not bring in a competing bidder or finance a raid on the company. The uneasiness, moreover, had existed not only on the part of these corporate clients, but within Drexel. Such client representations were integral to Joseph's and Siegel's shared vision of institution building, were in fact the mission with which Siegel had come to Drexel. But they were at odds with the gospel according to Milken, a gospel which taught that these corporate behemoths deserved to be taken over because they were being run inefficiently, so it was not only Professor I table to do so, but right. In the above instances, however, Milken had apparently acceded to Joseph and agreed to allow his piece to be bought. Now Milken's hands had been involuntarily tied. And the corporate establishment, no longer afraid, was no longer interested. Lear Siegler, for example, had followed Siegel from Kidder to Drexel. In its sale to Wicks, Drexel had been its investment banker. But about a week after Boesky Day, when that sale fell through, Lear Siegler brought in Goldman Sachs to study the alternatives of a leveraged buyout or a corporate recapitalization. With the Fortune 500 companies, it was all fear, remarked one former Drexel employee. In the summer and fall of '86, I would make a call to a CEO and the call would be returned in a half hour. Once Drexel started to fall, they never returned my calls. Now Drexel, which had used fear to wedge its way into corporate suites, was riddled with fear itself, fear of what the government might find, fear of losing business, fear of seeing the value of the FI-RM stock, widely held among about 2,050 employees, and its capital decimated, in the event the FI-RM had to pay crippling damages as a result of the investigation. Fear of the damage to recruitment. And, because of all this, fear of a mass exodus of employees, draining the FI-RM not only of talent but of capital as they demanded payout on their stock. In the FI-RST few months, about a half-dozen associates in corporate finance and M&A did leave Drexel. This was followed by a major defection in April, when an entire group of 7 professionals, including one senior-level executive, all of whom had been hired from Kidder within the past year, departed for Payne Weber. So fearful was Fred Joseph of an exodus, according to one Drexel employee, that in December '86 he broached the idea of soliciting signed loyalty pledges from all senior employees, promising that they would not leave the FI-RM for at least 1 year. Executives reportedly tried to dissuade him, arguing that it was distasteful, a sign of weakness on the FI-RM's part, and in any case unenforceable. Finally, Joseph abandoned the idea. For Joseph, who had had false starts in the business, who had dreamed back in the '70s of building an institution, as important as Goldman Sachs, and who had felt he was tantalizingly close to that goal, it must have been an agony to see it slip through his fingers. While Milken remained protectively cloistered as always, Joseph, the frontman, had to step into the glare of the public spotlight. Looking gray and puffy-eyed, photogenic no longer, he was shown, incredibly enough, sitting on the FL in his off-ICE on the cover of a December '86 issue of Fortune magazine, where the subtitle described him as "floored by the crisis." The ready and conference ident, albeit superficial, answers he had always produced were now replaced by ones so tentative and unsure that they invited parody among some of his partners, such as his quote in Businessweek, dated December 22. "What I think I'm conference ident of is that we don't know of anyone here who's done anything wrong." It was Joseph's personal crucible. He had assumed the post of CEO, from Robert Linton, who retained the title of chairman, but had clearly yielded the leadership of the FI-RM to Joseph, only about 18 months before Boesky Day. Back in the early '70s, Joseph had become chief operating officer of Shearson, Hamel, which, 6 months later, had to merge into Shearson Hayden Stone, through no fault of his. One Drexel executive recalled ruefully that at a meeting immediately after Joseph had assumed the top post at Drexel, John Sort, who had been with Joseph at Shearson, quipped, "Fred, how many months do you give us before we fail, with you as chief executive?" Joseph, more than anyone else, had been the architect of the institutional expansion of Drexel. For Milken the FI-RM was a vehicle, but for Joseph it was an end in itself. And Joseph possessed certain traits which had, in his lexicon, added value to the FI-RM. First, he was a super salesman, a great compliment to Milken on the corporate finance side, especially in the early days before Milken started doing everything himself. Second, he had a frontman personality that was so good it made you forget that that was what it was. Down to earth, good-humored, redolent with boyish charm, but all bright surface, with a veneer that never cracked. And, third, he had that overriding desire to win, which was probably the key to his and Milken's compatibility. His paramount contribution, however, was in a role that was much like that of a manager of a great Hollywood star. Joseph had managed Milken. Fred grabbed onto those, Milken's, coattails, directed them some, orchestrated them a lot to the public and to us, commented one Drexel executive. Now the Phi RM's shining star had become its greatest liability, and it was not so clear that Joseph's dominant traits were what this crisis required. In a time of terrible uncertainty, when the Phi RM was being publicly tarred with the suggestion that its key employees had committed crimes, its ideal leader would be decisive, strong and principled, the personified cation of integrity. There were at least two views of Joseph within the Phi RM. One was that while he came closer to monitoring Milken than anyone else, he still was kept in the dark about some things that transpired on the West Coast. Somewhat short of information, therefore, he was nonetheless seen as an honest, restraining force. Former corporate finance partner Julian Schroeder claimed, "Mike would do anything. I would have felt naked there without Fred." Schroeder added that on a visit to Drexel in the spring of '86 he had found Joseph in the midst of one of his many daily phone conversations with Milken, in which Joseph was saying, "Michael, you are the only one who can put yourself in jail. Now, don't do it." To Schroeder, this remark indicated that things had not changed since he left the Phi RM in 1984. Joseph was still struggling to control Milken. Another view, however, was that Joseph and Milken, consumed by a similar, religious Phi RE to win, were more in league than in counterpoint. And that Joseph, therefore, was more pragmatic than principled. As one Drexel employee maintained, Fred is great in an up market. In an up market, the leadership, the salesmanship, the upbeatness are the important things. But all the quick moves that in good times looked like a great salesman, in bad times looked dishonest. And when things are bad, he can't make a decision. Joseph, this employee said, is the consummate rationalizer about why somebody doesn't have to get Phi RED. There was a case to be made that the Phi RM should have either Phi RED or suspended Martin Siegel in December, after he had been subpoenaed in the grand jury investigation, and it seemed all of Wall Street was convinced that the Boesky-Siegel game was finally exposed. Siegel remained at the Phi RM until his plea was announced in February. Indeed, even the hiring of Siegel in early '86 arguably attests to Joseph's being long on pragmatism and short on principle, since Siegel was so widely rumored on the street to be involved in insider trading with Boesky. A stronger case could be made for the Phi ring of Jim Dahl, if Joseph believed that Dahl had in fact said what Staley alleged. And this was not the Phi RST complaint about Dahl. Beverly Hills Savings and Loan, in its lawsuit against Drexel and Dahl, had accused him of fraudulent misrepresentation. The same employee declared, Dahl was a loose cannon. He has put securities in people's accounts without calling them. We knew what he was, but Mike liked him, because he was productive. The Staley threats might not be illegal, but there should be a standard of conduct. But Fred's attitude when it came to firing Siegel or Dahl was, if we get rid of them, they will hurt us. Joseph, of course, would not have been the Phi RST chief executive to keep employees on so as not to create witnesses friendly to the government, with an investigation in progress. His lawyers might well have advised him not to fire the two. But a less defensible example of Joseph's elevation of pragmatism over principle was his decision, also urged by Milken, to bring Donald Engel back into the Phi RM. Engel had been a Phi XTURE at the Phi RM since the days of Burnham and Company. As Victor Posner became a more important Drexel client in the late '70s and early '80s, Engel had handled his account on the corporate finance side and become a director on several of the Posner-controlled companies' boards. According to many of his colleagues, Engel knew little about corporate finance, particularly in the sophisticated way that Drexel practiced it by the 80s, but he did have a way with clients. And, since the earliest days of the Predators Ball, he had been extremely useful to Milken on the social side, a perpetual gladhander, a happy panderer. Mike always respected Don's usefulness, declared one former member of the Milken Group. Don could make sure the clients got laid, and Mike didn't have to dirty himself. But in 1984 Engel was forced to resign. According to one Drexel executive, Engel had taken money from a Drexel client that should have been paid to the firm. Engel denies this charge. Some executives wanted to sever all ties with Engel, but Milken reportedly argued in his behalf, and in the end Engel became a consultant, negotiating a lucrative fee arrangement for any business he originated. Ironically enough, it was as a consultant that Engel saw his wealth accumulate. The clients with whom he had relationships, among them Peltz and Perelman, were Drexel kingpins by 1985. One Drexel employee said that Engel's compensation for 1986, probably including warrants, was about $9 million. And while Engel had had to relinquish his ICE at Drexel when he was forced to resign, his new business habitat was the third floor of his friend Perelman's townhouse. He still presented himself as a member of the firm. To reach Engel's ICE one called the Drexel switchboard. It was, then, the cushiest of exiles. But in January, '87, when Drexel's push for new clients had ground to a halt, and the firm seemed to be in danger of losing much if not all of the territory it had appropriated over the past decade, Engel was deemed too valuable to not be a full-fledged member of the team. Soliciting new clients was the business of the Investment Banking Group, IBG, formed in early 1986 and headed by corporate finance partner Chris Anderson. Even before the trauma triggered by Boesky Day, however, the IBG had been a failure, and by late 1987 the group would be disbanded. Anderson, who has a rambling, free associating habit of mind, was considered by his colleagues to be a creative investment banker but a poor administrator and ill-suited for this management post. Moreover, Anderson's attention to the IBG was sporadic, inasmuch as he and Stephen Weinroth in May of '86 had bought a 13% stake in Centronics Data Computer Corporation, a Drexel investment banking client. Though he and Weinroth had done this with Joseph's permission, their move had caused bad blood among many of their colleagues, particularly when Weinroth, Centronics' new chairman, discussed its becoming a deal-making vehicle whose deals might be in competition with some Drexel clients. Some at Drexel maintained that the real problem of the IBG lay in the firm's generally freewheeling, unstructured approach, exemplified in part by the Centronics situation. The Drexel culture encouraged entrepreneurism at every turn. Compliance, capital allocation, exposure and accounting were centralized, but all other decisions were left to the head of each group, so that the firm was run as a loosely connected association of free enterprises. Drexel was made up of little fiefdoms, with no rules, recalled one former IBG member. Joseph wanted it to be that way. It was supposed to be more entrepreneurial, and I guess it had worked for a while, especially when the place was smaller, but it didn't anymore. You'd, as a member of the IBG, call on a company and find out that, 4 weeks before, someone from corporate finance had been there. 3 weeks before, someone from M&A, and 2 weeks before, one of Mike's guys. No one had any idea what anyone else was doing. It was chaos. Now, in January '87, Engel was brought back to the firm to be co-head, with Anderson, of the IBG. Engel invited one of the IBG members, a recent recruit from a premier Wall Street firm, to break fast. He reportedly told this associate that he, Engel, was his new boss, not Anderson, and that he would be dealing directly with Milken. Symbolic of his stewardship, Engel had rechristened the IBG the Relationship Group. He is said to have explained that it was emphasizing relationships that would win the new clients, that was the style of business at which he excelled, and that the way to establish relationships was by getting in the minds of prospective clients and providing them what they wanted. This associate had heard Engel's analysis before. At the Tokyo Bond Conference, when he had Phi RST met Engel, Engel had allegedly remarked to him, "I understand CEOs. CEOs don't care about money, power or fame. They have all that. What they want is pussy. And I'm going to make sure they get it." Then, however, Engel had been only a consultant to the firm. Now he was this young investment banker's boss, ready to school the IBG in his kind of business getting. One Drexel executive recalled, he, the associate, said, "Amigod, everything they told me about Drexel over at. It was all true. The place is a total slime bucket." He immediately resigned from Drexel and returned to his former firm. At Drexel, the melodrama continued. Word had circulated about what had precipitated the associate's resignation. Younger employees at the firm did not know why Engel had been forced to resign in 1984. Many, knowing Engel as a notorious, compulsive womanizer, believed it had been for the kind of incident that had just occurred. But whatever the reason had been, it was clear to these fresh-faced Harvard MBAs, who had had their pick of the Phi RMS on Wall Street and had chosen Drexel, that Engel, like his longtime client Victor Posner, was an unsavory reminder of the old Drexel, which would be better forgotten. If there was ever a time for the firm to cultivate a straight arrow image, they thought, surely this was it. Anderson and Weinroth, who both had opposed Engel's reinstatement, now threatened to resign unless he was forced to resign again. And within 2 weeks, by early February, there was such a popular groundswell against Engel that people were calling it a revolution. When Engel tried to enter an IBG meeting on February 6, Anderson ordered him out. Engel left the room and called John Kissick in Beverly Hills, who was participating in the meeting via a hookup. Engel's strongest support had always come from the coast. Kissick said he thought it was okay for Engel to attend. As soon as the meeting broke, Anderson walked across the street to Drexel's executive off ICES to deliver his resignation to Joseph. Weinroth said he would resign, too. Another corporate finance partner, Alan Brumberger, calling in from out of town, said he would join them. Joseph, who in earlier, more upbeat times had described himself as the Dr. Feelgood of Drexel, reportedly asked for 1 week to try to resolve the problem in a way that would make everyone happy. That, however, was not possible, and Engel was forced to resign. He resumed his consultant status. Engel's reinstatement had lasted less than a month. It is true that in the larger scheme of Drexel's troubles it was only a sideshow. But at a time when Drexel employees were already shell-shocked, depressed, embarrassed, defensive and fearful for their futures, it managed to make morale even worse, holding up a mirror to the firm and reflecting an unsightly image. That image had nothing to do with what the government was investigating, and yet it had everything to do with it. Engel's procurement of women for clients was not conduct the government would likely seek to prosecute, but its significance lay in the larger truth that it revealed about Drexel. For whether it meant procuring women, or threatening would-be clients, the resounding credo at Drexel was to do whatever it took to win. Everything bowed before that credo. Morality and legality became mere conventions, accepted modes of conduct for the foot soldiers of the world, the less creative, less aggressive, less visionary. The iconoclastic Milken, in whose image the firm had been formed, had always disdained conventional ways of seeing, conventional ways of doing business. And, thanks to his fluid outing of convention, Drexel had apotheosized out of nothingness. It was that credo that had led to Engel's reinstatement. Joseph is said to have personally abhorred Engel. He may have also personally abhorred Engel's function, though he must have known and accepted it for years. He had made a show of enormous though disingenuous indignation to Institutional Investor in an interview for its August 1986 Milken Professor Ila, when the subject of hookers at the Chasen's dinner and Bungalow 8 was raised. Telling Institutional Investor that he went bananas when he heard the stories, Joseph added, "I discussed it with Michael and I said, if there ever is a hooker there, I'll fire everybody in sight, I'll kill everybody." And everyone said, "Fred, it's not true, you're overreacting, you're nuts." I said, "All right, but not one woman who would embarrass us if someone knew exactly what she did for a living. And I think I can guarantee you that there isn't a single woman there who doesn't have a legitimate reason to be there and that none of them are hookers." It may well be that had history allowed Joseph to pursue his longtime vision of building an institution comparable to Goldman Sachs, he ultimately would have done away with Engel and his cast of, in case anyone asked, aspiring actresses and would-be models. But when the firm began to disintegrate around him, Joseph applied Drexel's one abiding test to the question of whether to bring Engel back. He thought, said one employee, with a shrug, that Donnie would be good for business. That quintessentially pragmatic credo, whatever it takes to win, may have shaped Drexel's response to the investigation, as well. In the first month or two after Boesky Day, the firm was in turmoil, apparently without a FIXED defensive strategy, taking the crisis day by day. There was a considerable amount of anxiety about who might be cooperating with the government. Some days, corporate finance executives in New York considered casting the West Coast adrift, telling the government that they had known things were not right out there, but never been sure of the specifics, so had not gone to the authorities, and that they wanted now to make their separate peace. But ultimately this notion had been vetoed as too ignoble, too disloyal to the regent who had made them all richer than they would ever have been without him, and also impractical, since it would have been difficult for the firm to escape liability. Instead, Drexel would present a united front and, unless the government came up with a smoking gun, fight back. Apparently, the closest thing to a smoking gun that the government had was that $5.30 million payment made from Boesky to Drexel in Beverly Hills. And after Boesky's auditors had demanded some documentation, Lowell Milken and Donald Balser had signed the invoice stating the payment was a fee for consulting and advisory services. In an article in the New York Times in February by James Sterngold, several Drexel executives were quoted, elaborating on this, saying that the payment was for several takeover bids, for the Financial Corporation of Santa Barbara, Scott and Fetzer, and U.S. News and World Report magazine, among others, that Boesky had asked them to work on but had never consummated. One Drexel official added that in some instances Boesky had backed out at the last minute, and that part of the $5.30 million was meant as compensation to Drexel for its work on these deals. After-the-fact explanations, however, accompanied by no corroborating documentation tend to fall rather flat, particularly when set alongside the paper trail of records kept by Boesky which corroborated his version and which the government was said to have collected, according to sources quoted by Stewart and Hertzberg in the Wall Street Journal. One Drexel employee claimed that this problem, the lack of a paper trail for their side, had been solved by Drexel's fabricating one. Interviewed in early April, '87, this employee claimed that the books were cooked in the previous month or so, to show at least one specific charge to Boesky that had never existed, as part of that $5.30 million. About $1 million for research, related to Boesky's abortive takeover bids. If true, this was not only a desperate but an ill-considered gambit, since it appeared somewhat implausible on its face. While Drexel's research has become well regarded in the last couple of years, it was considerably less strong back in 1984, when the work on these bids would have occurred. It is especially unlikely that Boesky, who prided himself on his research capabilities in his own shop, would have paid for Drexel's. Moreover, when Boesky did utilize research from Wall Street firms, he was often given it gratis, in exchange for the commission dollars that the firms earned from his trading. A Drexel spokesman has stated that contemporaneously with the billing of the $5.30 million fee in March 1986, an internal memorandum directed that the fee be allocated among the corporate finance, research and high-yield bond departments, and there have been no subsequent changes. 17. The humbling. 1 year after Boesky Day, Drexel was still in limbo. Its likely indictment spelled out in great detail in the press many months before but not yet issued by any grand jury. In the world at large, however, events had not stood still. On October 19, 1987, the stock market's horrific crash was thought at the time to signal the end of an era in which a 5-year surging bull market whipped Wall Street into a frenzy of deal-making, an era in which financial fantasy routinely came true. In the wake of the crash, debt and leverage, which had seemed to possess magical properties for the conjuring of enormous wealth in the corporate arena, were demystified, seen as tools of excess which might now, in the harsh light of day and a possible recession, exact their toll. The spell, for the moment at least, was broken. Milken had not created the M&A binge of the 80s. Indeed, he had been an outsider, relegated to the sidelines until he and his colleagues provided their chosen with war chests and refined the concept of the Air Fund, conceived of in a go-by seminar but never implemented, into the highly conference ident letter. But once Milken won entry to the game, he did more to shape it than any other individual. It seemed only appropriate, in a sense, that this era might draw to a close now that its impresario was so hamstrung, though by early 1988 M&A would again be thriving and Milken would not yet be enjoined from the scene. For the past several years, while Drexel and its rivals were underwriting billions of dollars of junk bonds to finance scores of superleveraged acquisitions, critics had predicted that this mountainous debts test and failure would come in the next recession. They pointed out that in the early 80s recession the megadeals junk bonds had not yet existed, and that credit quality of junk had been deteriorating in the last couple of years. Therefore, they maintained, there had been no test of the junk market in its current, $150 billion form. In the October 1987 crash, junk bonds did fall in price, with the average junk portfolio losing at worst about 10% of its value. This was not surprising, since they are really part debt, part equity, and their value tends to fluctuate with the equity markets as much as or more than with the bond markets, their key variable being less the direction of interest rates than the perceived ability of the issuer to service its debt. While investors fled to Treasury bonds, which staged a huge rally as the stock market plunged, junk bonds yielded a near-record 5.5 percentage points over Treasury bonds with comparable maturities. In the weeks after the crash, the market for new junk issues was scarce, even at interest rates of 17 to 18%. And a scattering of obituaries for junk began to appear in the press. But they were wrong. For by mid-November, 1 month after the crash, the prices of the stronger junk issues had rebounded dramatically, while the weaker issues, among them credits which were dependent on asset sales to meet their debt obligations, for example, did not. At this point, it was a winnowing out of the junk market, not its demise. Moreover, the issues and deals that got so badly pounded by the crash that they overnight became symbols of the changed world in junk were by and large not Drexel's. Fruehof bonds, for example, underwritten by Merrill Lynch, were at 82 to 84 just before the crash, and 2 weeks later were at 60 to 70. Also, in the wake of the crash, the Thompson family's management buyout of Southland Corporation was temporarily stalled, mid-deal, when its $1.50 billion of junk bonds could not be sold, even at rates of 18%. The investment banks at risk in Southland, at risk because they had been the lead lenders in a $600 million bridge loan extended to Southland the previous August, and now it was not at all clear that the bridge loan could be paid down, were Solomon and Goldman Sachs. About 2 months later, however, the Southland deal was restructured to offer investors an added sweetener of warrants, and it proceeded. After the crash, too, bridge loans suddenly lost their panache. They were now seen for what they had always been, serious risks to the investment banks which had extended them. Drexel had extended some, but had been far charier than most of the other major FI-RMS. Milken rejected the critics' premise that the market had not been tested. Critics, he said in a late November interview with this reporter, were using the wrong benchmark, because they lacked historical perspective. While it was true that broad public issuance of non-investment grade securities had started in 1977, he repeatedly emphasized that there had been a large high-yielding market, comprised mainly of fallen angels and paper issued in exchange offers, by 1960. And this market, he asserted, had been tested in 1970–71, and even more severely in both 1974–75 and 1980–81. The success of high-yield investments during these 3 periods was testimony to the diversity and underlying strength of high-yield companies themselves, Milken added. We were there to help provide advice and liquidity to both companies and investors during those periods, and we will be again, he declared. In reflecting upon it, the greatest opportunity to help, strengthen and build is during difficult economic times. By late '87, those difficult times had not yet impacted the rest of the country, but they had hit Wall Street. The retrenchment had started earlier in the year, after several major FI-RMS suffered severe trading losses because of interest rate volatility, but after the crash it proceeded with a vengeance. E.F. Hutton was purchased by Shearson Lehman Brothers. Some specialist FI-RMS were bought by Drexel, Merrill Lynch, Bear, Stearns, and others. Layoffs, bonus cutting, and reduction of overhead expenses were pandemic. Drexel was no exception, though its cuts were less dramatic than some FI-RMs. 100 of its 11,000 employees were laid off, and its bonuses were reduced, less so for star performers. Corporate America, witnessing Wall Street's distress, might have felt a certain mean-spirited gratification. For while hundreds of public companies had undergone paroxysms of restructuring, overhead cutting, layoffs and elimination of research and development in order to escape an acquirer's clutches, Wall Street, insider of and handmaiden to all this frantic activity, had only grown fatter. But it could not last. Most of the Wall Street FI-RMS, after all, had relinquished their private partnership status over the last decade and become public companies themselves. Now the scythe had turned in their direction. Solomon, its earnings down and management poor, had become quarry for Ronald Perelman in August 1987. Solomon had managed to fend him off by selling a substantial stake to Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. The event served not only as an indicator of Wall Street's vulnerability but also as a reminder of how quickly this world had changed. Exactly 2 years earlier, the bid for Revlon by the unknown Perelman had seemed, almost, amusing. Now Perelman was a corporate titan to be reckoned with. Barring an apocalypse, the chain reaction collapse of dozens of junk bond financed, highly leveraged companies, which would then impact the junk portfolios of insurance companies, thrifts, pension funds, mutual funds and others, it will be 10 years before Milken's legacy becomes clear. Takeovers, buyouts and restructurings would have occurred if there had been no Michael Milken, but it is hard to imagine that they would have occurred in the size and volume that they did. And it will take time to discern whether, on balance, those financial maneuvers created leaner, stronger companies, by imposing the discipline of debt, by dismantling inefficient giants and putting their parts into the hands of managers who owned a piece and so did a better job, or whether they created undernourished, non-productive, non-competitive companies, crippled by the debt which in many instances had served only to enrich the short-term investors, and, of course, their investment bankers. In all likelihood, both scenarios had occurred, and the question would be which was demonstrably more prevalent. This, of course, was the debate that had raged through the mid-80s. In the speeches Milken gave in 1986, when he was at the zenith of his power, he had risen to it eagerly. Peltz and Perelman, Beatrice and Metromedia, had been his glowing success stories. But by late 1987 the companies that Milken and others at Drexel were pointing to with pride were Comdisco, the computer company, Hovnanian, the successful home builder, Kinder Care, the provider of daycare, although by late 1987, contrary to Drexel's depiction, the firm was moving into the financial services area and becoming a buyer of junk bonds. These were all companies which over the last decade had issued junk bonds and used the capital to grow, but not through acquisition, not by doing buyouts. It was as though Milken had entered a time warp, as though he were back in the late 70s and early 80s, raising junk bonds for small and medium-sized companies that needed capital and couldn't get it anywhere else. As though the last several years of his raising hundreds of millions for the high-rolling entrepreneurs who barely knew what to do with such sums, until he told them, of raising billions of dollars for the biggest, most leveraged acquisitions ever done in the history of this country, had not happened. The ultimate goal of the massive public relations campaign Drexel would mount in ads in newspapers and magazines throughout 1987 was to obliterate Drexel's M&A spectacular of 1985–86, to purge the public memory of Drexel's leading role. In the first few months of 1987, the campaign was more defensive and less focused. Drexel ran one centerfold in the Wall Street Journal listing, all in identical tiny print, with no titles, the names of its 10,000 employees, as though to emphasize that there were thousands of other people at Drexel in addition to the ones whose names were appearing regularly in the journal's articles on the government investigation. And in an effort to counter persistent rumors on the street that it was losing business, Drexel ran ads that listed hundreds of its faithful clients. But by the spring of 1987, the campaign developed a stronger message, that junk bonds, after years of hating and resisting the nomenclature, Drexel officials had decided there were more important battles to fight were good for America. Inside the firm there was a 2-week-long celebration, open to all employees, of seminars, sports events and LMS, all devoted to this proposition. Thousands of square green pins were distributed, reading, "Junk bonds keep America fit." One music video, along more general morale-boosting lines, showed Drexel employees mouthing the words to a hit song by Billy Ocean. "When the going gets tough," chanted Bob Linton and Fred Joseph along with brokers and mail clerks, "Drexel gets going." The message Drexel was attempting to convey in its in-house and public campaigns was that junk bonds provided the only access to the public debt market for mainstream America, 95% of American businesses. That the companies that issued them were the vital, growing sector of American industry that had provided new jobs in the last decade, while the employee ranks at investment-grade giants were declining. There was a sort of truth to this. The 95% figure is somewhat obfuscating. Drexel's reasoning went this way. There are about 23,000 companies in the United States with sales over $25 million. Only 800 of them, however, qualify for investment-grade ratings. Therefore, that leaves some 22,000, or 95%, that are in the junk bailiwick. The problem with this arithmetic is that the vast majority of those 22,000 companies have not applied for ratings and have not issued junk bonds. From 1977 to 1986, about 1,200 companies, not 22,000, became issuers of over $114 billion of junk bonds. The job formation claim suffered from a similar vulnerability. In the last 3 years, Drexel stated in 1987, America's largest companies have been cutting their workforce. They have decreased employment by 4%. Junk issuers, however, have expanded employment by over 24%. What was left unsaid was the fact that the employment roles at some of those large companies had been cut after defensive restructurings, undertaken to fend off Drexel-backed bidders. Sometimes Drexel attacked the problem head-on, as in ads stating that a prevalent misconception is that junk bonds are responsible for the recent proliferation of hostile takeover activity. On the contrary, Drexel asserted, less than 10% of successful tender offers, 1981 to 86, were funded by junk bonds. True enough, except that the junk bond financed hostile takeover had only 2 preliminary runs, Mesa Gulf and Reliance Disney, prior to 1985. And this statistic also omits, of course, all those raids which threw off hundreds of millions in Professor ITS to the bidder, the shareholders and Drexel, which intensified the fever of restructuring through corporate America, but which did not take their targets. In the last few months of 1987, however, Drexel forsook such didacticism in favor of a softer, more impressionistic approach. One full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal featured a photograph of a group of workers at an Arkansas steel plant, where Drexel claimed to have saved jobs through its financing for the plant's parent company, Quanex. Another showed a picture of a couple, the wife pregnant, and their toddler in front of a house under construction, being built by Hovnanian, a company which, without its access to junk bonds, would not have been able to provide 50,000 people with a living room and 20,000 people with a living. Drexel also took its campaign to television, spending some $4 million. In late, 87 2/60-second commercials, in the same soft, sentimental vein as the recent print ads, appeared. One of them featured an energy plant in Vidalia, Louisiana, whose construction was financed by Drexel's junk bonds, with a resultant reduction in unemployment in Vidalia by over 20%. Before the plant was built, the commercial stated, over 16% of the residents of Vidalia had been unemployed. Among the problems here, as pointed out in an article by Wall Street Journal reporter Lori Cohen, was that the commercial was not shot in Vidalia. That unemployment statistics for Vidalia, as distinguished from the surrounding parish, do not exist. That a Louisiana Department of Labor official stated he disagreed with the claim that the plant had helped to reduce unemployment by 20%, and that moreover most of the people who worked at the plant didn't live in Vidalia. In its eagerness to alter its image radically, from the host of decadents at the Predators Ball, the Raiders' money machine, the firearm that in 1985–86 gave new meaning to greed on Wall Street, to a wholesome, civic-minded provider of capital, and thereby jobs, to this nation's little people, Drexel was fudging facts. The problem, however, was not so much these specific obfuscations as the overall image. Drexel had provided financing for growth to small and medium-sized companies which would have had trouble finding capital elsewhere. It had built a thriving market of this original issue debt where none had existed before. It could reasonably sustain the claim made in its 87 ad campaign that it had furthered the democratization of capital. But if Drexel had limited itself to that initial source of supply, never financing the buyouts, or the leveraged acquisitions of 1985–86, it would have remained one of the second-class citizens of Wall Street, highly Professor I table, because of those 3 to 4% spreads, but barely noticed by the premier RMS and their clients. It would have been an outsider in the M&A world, instead of its hot center. Without that new supply source, the junk market, the best barometer of Drexel's influence, would never have increased in size so quickly. In 1981, before Drexel had started issuing junk for LBOs, the new issue market was $1.30 billion. In 1986, a year when the new issue market increased by 52%, it was $32.40 billion, not including private placements. And all junk debt outstanding was approximately $125 billion. While Drexel was striving to expunge from history its period of triumph and sovereignty, it was not disowning the king. It is true that in the early months of the investigation, when Drexel employees feared that indictments and perhaps the FIRM's collapse were imminent, there had been some sentiment in New York that Milken and his troops should be cut adrift. But as time passed without indictments, hope grew that the government was having